It seems like every few years, Starship Troopers needs to have its satire spelled out again. The 1997 Paul Verhoeven sci-fi epic posed a futuristic society obsessed with killing bug-like aliens from another planet. Although the source material of the original book by Robert Heinlein favors the space marine tale as a positive one, Verhoeven hated the book, having said he put the book down after a few chapters for it being too right-wing. He decided to frame the film more as a critique of both the book and fascists that would idolize such a society. I saw Starship Troopers in theaters at the age of 12, much too young to be watching a film with gratuitous gore and nudity, but also too young to read the many layers of fascistic satire. That being said, I could tell that something was off about the protagonists, even if I couldn't quite put my finger on it at the time. I knew something was up when I heard the uncomfortable laughter when Neil Patrick Harris walks into the room with that fascistic uniform. As I got older, I learned more about media, more about fascism, more about propaganda, and more about the intentions of Paul Verhoeven. And then the fascism satire just clicked. Some people did not exactly grow up the same, however. Starship Troopers recently popped back into the social media discourse when a collective of uncritical folks decided to claim the fascism satire was erroneous. There are usually two types of arguments for this claim. There is the ignorant route of proclaiming that Starship Troopers was apolitical. In their minds, it's not a film that says anything. It's just a brainless sci-fi action movie, and any political messaging was either an accident or headcanon. And then there is the opposite argument, that Starship Troopers is political, but that its depiction of the future is aspirational instead of cautionary and is definitely not about fascism.
Why do I want this unironically? The answer is because Starship Troopers is a manifesto for Jordan Peterson's utopia.
Up yours, woke moralists.
No matter the tactic, both arguments amount to the same thing: to argue that the film is not satirizing fascism. To them, the fact that the opening sequence utilizes similar filmmaking to Leni Riefenstahl's Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will was just an accident, even though it definitely wasn't. To them, Verhoeven's fictionalized future is not dystopian, but utopian, even though the director had openly stated that it was meant to be dystopian. To them, having your civil rights restricted unless you serve in the military is great, despite that such a society sounds like a f***ing nightmare for people who do not fit the military mold. Basically, they want a stratocracy. Would you like to know more? Stratocracy is a form of government run entirely by the military. This means more than just the military assuming roles of administrative, judicial, and legislative branches. It's also supported by the laws and very culture of that society. A stratocracy does not necessarily mean that this government is ruled by one person as in an autocracy, or a small handful of people as in an oligarchy. But within the narrative of Starship Troopers, it does seem to lean a little bit more towards an oligarchy. Stratocracies should be familiar to those who follow a lot of science fiction. Examples of this include the Cardassian Union from Star Trek and the Galactic Empire from Star Wars. And hey, wouldn't you know it, in both cases, they're the bad guys. It's worth noting that part of the reason that Starship Troopers came back into the discourse is because of Helldivers 2, a video game harboring a similar style and accompanied by satirical fascist propaganda. This satire seemed so obvious, but when a Twitter account for the game pointed this out, it was immediately met with naysayers who wanted to pretend a video game with political propaganda satire was somehow apolitical or aspirational. And that brought us back to the Starship Troopers debate. So let's address a few of the faulty social media claims about how Starship Troopers is not the satire that everyone claims it to be. There was a whole thread about this on Twitter, which I'm not going to reference here, but suffice to say, these arguments are pretty common. So think of this as like a guideline for when this topic comes up again in the future. One of the claims was that the director wasn't satirizing the novel, but just doing an over-the-top rendition. Okay, yeah, the film was over the top, but why? Why did Verhoeven choose to make his sci-fi action film more ridiculous than serious when compared to the novel? Don't you think he was trying to say something in this depiction? It's not a matter of studio meddling. Verhoeven has been very vocal about how this was always the film that he planned to make. And as previously mentioned, he had been very blunt about how much he hated the book. So this is just a lazy excuse to ignore everything surrounding the film, and turn your brain all the way off when watching the movie. The next claim is that the military of this film are not the subject of satire because they are good-looking people. Yes, in their minds, beautiful people can't be evil. After all, they're beautiful. This is not only a dim view of media considering how many beautiful and sexy villains exist, but it's also an inherent view of how fascism lionizes beauty as good on its surface. Fascists have a specific vision of the future, and it's a future they only want to reserve for a certain type of people more than others. Verhoeven specifically chose the most white, blue-eyed actors that he could find to echo the propaganda of Riefenstahl. So no, the fact that Starship Troopers doesn't prominently feature people that look ugly was not an accidental casting choice or just Hollywood being Hollywood. It was an intentional piece of the fascistic satire. The next claim is that the movie's future is utopian because it's a clean society. Because in this world, the streets are clean and free of homeless encampments and ghettos. To some viewers, this seems like a better world, a utopia. But it's really not. Would you like to know more? This misreading of the film comes from an inability to recognize a false utopia, referring to a world that looks perfect on the outside but hides its more hideous aspects that go unresolved. So, why is this aspect so hard for some people to read in Starship Troopers? Perhaps it's because the curtains are never fully pulled back in the film. Starship Troopers never showcases the ugliness lurking under its pristine exterior, and that's a deeper questioning of how willing we, the audience, are to recognize the concealed horror. There are rarely dissenting voices about this type of society. The very few dissenters are shouted down by loudmouth pundits and bitter recruits. The fact that the war goes unquestioned and nobody finds a problem with the obvious fascist uniforms should be concerning. We also don't hear much about the people who don't comply with service for citizenship. What about those who can't serve in the military for either a mental or physical disability? These are darker questions never firmly answered in the film because the characters never question this aspect of their society. All the eeriness of the fascistic tones are treated as ubiquitous. And it's so easy to ignore all of the hideous history within this film, considering that Rico was less interested in learning history and more concerned with making vector art hentai. The other claim is that because the Federation is over the top, their cruelty comes off more hilarious than cruel. And again, this is another trapping of accepting this world. The basic training we're shown in the film features someone getting stabbed in the hand, which is horrifying, not to mention detrimental to the health and well-being of the soldiers being trained. This type of cruelty is over the top, not because it's justified, but because this is a world that has long since stopped caring about being seen as cruel. The cruelty also comes in the form of manipulation. In the early classroom scenes, the teacher/soldier played by Michael Ironside speaks not about how the students don't understand civic morality within a fascistic society, but that they don't believe it. It's not important that they learn the ins and outs of their society, just that they accept it almost blindly. Later in the film, when Jenkins is testing his psychic abilities with Rico, Jenkins showcases how he misuses this power to manipulate his ferret into bugging his mom. When Rico states that he hopes Jenkins won't use this psychic power on someone like him, Jenkins simply states that he can't use his power on humans yet. There is no moral consideration over whether or not psychics can control human beings. But let's be real here. If the Federation had access to willingly control the minds of people to do their bidding, they would absolutely take advantage of this. One would think this staging would make the satire clear, but it's apparently not for some viewers who still need their hand to be held. The more common claim about the Federation being in the right is because the bugs they fight are grotesque, violent creatures that will wipe out all of humanity. Okay, so there's some glaring facts omitted from this claim. The alien bugs were provoked into fighting. The Federation landed on the planet with the arachnid aliens and set up an outpost without the consent of the aliens. The alien bugs, unable to communicate with the humans, asserted their dominance over their land by wiping out the outpost. The aliens then fire back on Earth for daring to colonize their planet. And that's apparently all the justification the Federation needs to launch a full-scale invasion of the planet, wasting wave after wave of soldiers and starships, all in the name of revenge and galactic colonialism. The arguments I've heard for the Federation being in the right here with the bugs is just weird. It is usually something like, what do you expect the colonists to do on the planet? Talk to the bug creatures and tell them not to murder humans? No, but I'd expect the humans not to attempt their manifest destiny bullshit on a planet full of bugs they clearly can't communicate with, and would clearly fight back if provoked when they were being invaded. I mean, even Futurama understood the joke of Starship Troopers.
We're the evil invading aliens?
Correct.
Then I guess you learned a valuable lesson. Don't mess with Earth!
Defending the Federation in its mission is to defend colonizers and invaders, trying to wipe out an other, something fascists love to do. Okay, so wrapping back around to the prettiness argument, there's also the claim that the bugs should receive no sympathy in their defense or their fear because they look ugly. Judging whether or not a living creature deserves to live or die based on how it looks is... I don't quite want to say fascist, but it is dumb. Like, I mean, it does lean into fascist tactics, but it's just a ridiculous way to look at life. I think bees are kind of ugly, but I still don't think that means they should all be wiped out. This claim is also based on a reinforced ignorance, as when the film's Tucker Carlson-looking pundit refuses to believe that the bugs are intelligent creatures and that we should approach them as such. The good news is that with all these terrible claims being made on social media apps, there were plenty of replies to debunk these claims about Starship Troopers not being satire of fascism. But most of the opposition who wanted to claim that Starship Troopers was not saying anything bad about fascism just did not care about being corrected. They either brushed off the evidence with more easily debunked claims, or when presented with clear alignment in the film's staging of the faults of fascism and its autocracy, merely gave the response of based. And it's always the same claim trying to be made here, that Starship Troopers is not making a political statement, but sometimes it is making a political statement that is good and not about fascism being bad. Somehow. Despite all the evidence to the contrary.
We wanted to tell the story of a really wonderful, adventurous story about these young boys and girls fighting bugs, but we also wanted to show that these people are really in their heart, or without knowing it, I would say, they're on their way to fascism. So it was like telling one story is these guys are great and wonderful heroes, and the other story was, by the way, they're fascist.
Verhoeven is no stranger to satire. You need only look to his previous sci-fi film, RoboCop, a movie loaded with overt satire of how corporations control law enforcement and how ineffective the government is at wielding weapons of mass destruction. And believe it or not, there are some people who can't read the satire of RoboCop either, and just think it's some mindless, apolitical action movie. I could explain why, but it'd take a whole other video to explain. Anyway, much of Verhoeven's pre-Hollywood films were highly provocative and not subtle about what they were trying to skewer. Everything from sexuality to religion were viciously gutted in Verhoeven's early works. The idea that Verhoeven wasn't injecting any of that knowing satire within Starship Troopers and that the whole fascistic satire was just post-text essays recontextualizing the film is just absurd. Verhoeven didn't accidentally satirize Triumph of the Will. He grew up in Nazi-occupied territory, for f***'s sake. The sad truth of the matter is that people trying to claim that Starship Troopers is not about fascism are triggering a defense mechanism. They want to love this movie world, believing that this is more of a utopian society than a false utopia. To admit that the film was really about fascism would also mean having to admit that the world they admired was one built on fascism. With this in mind, they would have to admit to either being wrong about the film or own up to being a fascist. Both routes make them look bad. Now that might warrant pity for the people who misread this film, but the truth is that obscuring fascism is itself a fascist tactic. It is in the best interest of fascists to not outwardly proclaim that they are indeed fascist. Instead, they manipulate people into believing in fascism with clever word choices, similar to the language within Starship Troopers. Would you like to know more? Do you know that scene in The Simpsons where Lionel Hutz tries to change the vocabulary when selling homes to make them seem more appealing? Fascist apologists basically do that to avoid looking bad for the gross stuff they want to promote.
All I did was tell the truth.
Of course you did, but there's the truth and the truth. Let me show you.
You call Nazis fascist? Well, I call them socialists, based on the fact that they acknowledge themselves as National Socialists, and I cannot discern between that and other forms of socialism. You see sexism and racism within fascist ideology? Well, I call it preserving traditional values. Do your history books say fascism is based on right-wing concepts that align with conservative notions? Well, I say fascism is left-wing because fascists are mean and a leftist was mean to me once. In order to believe any of this, and to continue believing that Starship Troopers is not a satire of fascism, is to ignore and discredit any and all evidence, including the open admittance by the film's director. Or to put it another way, it's an excuse to be ignorant, a means of burying your head in the sand and refusing to accept reality. And these tactics are not new. This type of propaganda has been going on for decades, long before Starship Troopers came out. Fascists need people to believe that they're not fascists so that their political power can quietly gain momentum. The only way to ensure that fascism doesn't rise to a high level of governance is to recognize its various components and combat it when you see it. This is also why nothing I'm saying here about Starship Troopers is new. There are plenty of videos and written essays detailing Starship Troopers' satire and fascism. I am just one more voice trying to clarify the point, and hopefully one more nail in the coffin of declaring Starship Troopers as an aspirational world. Because when you can finally accept what Starship Troopers is trying to satirize, it becomes such a great film to watch.
Hi, I'm Paul Verhoeven. I would like to show you a test that I did for my new movie, Starship Troopers. But perhaps I should give you a warning. Don't look now!